and welcome to FinextraTV's 2021 prediction series. I'm Hannah Wallace, and calling in now is Johan Javeus from SEB. So welcome, Johan. Thank you very much for calling in.
Thank you.
It's good to have you on. So your role as Chief Strategist for SEB Research means you focus on topical research for new trends in the economy and financial markets, making you the perfect candidate for our prediction series today. And I want to speak off the back of a recent article you wrote that predominantly looked at how sustainability is being put high up on the business agenda as climate change is becoming, I think it's fair to say, a snowballing concern. So let's start there. Could you tell us what's the significance of COVID-19 in this space, especially for businesses planning ahead? And what do you think is the response recently from banks, governments, and also regulators? By no means a small question, but let's start there.
Well, it's a huge topic, of course, but as I see it, COVID has had a very large effect on the climate issue. And I'm not talking about the fact that the shutdowns has led to reduced emissions because we don't move around as much as we used to, but it's also caused major disruptions to how we used to work and how we used to shop. It's more e-commerce these days and more working from home. And while many of us, of course, will go back to the office once the pandemic has ended, I think that we will continue to work much more from home than we did before the pandemic, and the same goes for e-commerce. So it will have lasting positive effect on the amount of emissions. And the other thing, it has to do with the economic hardships that we have seen in wake of the pandemic. And that has caused governments, as we are all aware of, around the world to launch huge support packages to help with the longer term rebuild of the economy. And as it seems, a lot of this money is now going to be spent with a clear tilt towards climate and green investments. And we should remember that a lot of that money should not have been spent or invested if we hadn't had the pandemic. So it's really brought the whole climate issue forward, and in many respects, I think the climate is one of the few beneficiaries from the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just the banks and the regulators and those at the top, is it? It's the consumer as well. Just you and I on our daily lives with shifting values around climate change. So what impact do you think this is having on the decisions made at the top with regards to sustainability reporting and also those looking to protect their reputation, perhaps?
I mean, consumers are super important. I mean, their call for a stronger focus on climate issues is shifting demand on a global level. And companies that want to continue to sell their products, they must make sure that they do this in an environmentally friendly way. And voters, of course, when they put climate on the top of their agendas, it's also giving politicians a green light to go ahead with necessary changes in regulations and setting new ambitious targets for moving towards a more sustainable society. Mm-hmm. One example of this, the EU taxonomy, basically a set of rules and standards that EU-based companies will be required to follow to report their climate footprint. And this will, of course, make it easier for investors to measure how environmentally sustainable the companies are, and also how environmentally sustainable the financial products that they are thinking about investing in are. So this will be a great help to both corporates and consumers. Mm-hmm. It will boost sustainable investments and put more pressure on companies to do more in terms of reducing their climate footprint. So a lot is being done.
All right, so what might we see as climate change hits the election cycle? And do you think we can expect better US climate policies under new President Biden? What about that?
Well, under Donald Trump, the US has pursued directly climate hostile policies over the past 4 years. And this includes everything from green lighting further fossil fuel extractions to enacting in large-scale environmental deregulation, and of course also leaving the Paris Agreement. And with Joe Biden, we will see a completely different focus on climate policies. The US has already rejoined the Paris Agreement, and he will also propose a major climate package totaling $2 trillion aimed at creating more green jobs, and of course also accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable society. And another important aspect of this is that Biden is also a strong proponent of global cooperation and of allowing the US to resume its leading roles in various international forums. And this is important because climate issues, by their very nature, almost always have to be addressed at the global level. So the absence of the US over the past 4 years has been a major problem that is now being addressed and corrected.
Well, it certainly feels like things are looking up in that space then. And I just want to go back and revisit what the EU is doing with regards to investing in the transition. Let's talk a bit more about that, but also what do you think about central banks? Do you think they're on the verge of becoming, say, climate activists? What about that?
Well, if we start with central banks, obviously I think they are. There are a lot of indications now that climate will be the next major issue for central banks that they will start to address. The European central banks and the Swedish Riksbank, they've already taken concrete steps to incorporate climate issues into their monetary policies. We've seen some signals that the Bank of Japan is starting to think along the same lines, now talking about climate change as being the greatest threat to the world economy, thereby also saying that central banks has a role to play. I still think that for this to really take off, we need to have the biggest, most important central bank of them all on board, and that is the Federal Reserve. And during the Trump years, that was almost impossible, given that for the Fed to start to take environmental issues into monetary policy would be in direct conflict with what Trump was doing. But with Joe Biden, it's a completely different thing. And he has also appointed a former Fed chairman, Janet Yellen, to become his Treasury Secretary. So I think there is a lot of signs that the Fed will become more active in this space. As far as what governments are doing, of course, there's a lot happening. The EU, they've adopted very new or very ambitious climate targets. Member countries have agreed basically that the EU should be climate neutral by 2050, and they will reduce emissions by 55% by 2030. So obviously these are very ambitious goals, and important, they've also put a lot of resources in achieving those goals. The 7-year budget is approved, and they've also approved this support package for the economy. So in total, over the next 7 years, they will spend 1.8 trillion euros, of which at least 30% is earmarked for climate investments. So a lot of things are happening, both with central banks, but also with governments.
Well, as you say, some really ambitious goals, but it really feels like things are looking up for the year ahead, especially seeing that we've had a pretty turbulent 2020, so some things to look forward to. But Johan, thank you so much for calling in and sharing your insights in this space. It's been really interesting, so thank you.
Thank you.